Welcome back to the program. We are here today with Matthew Ho, who is a former U.S. Marine officer and also State Department official. So thank you for coming on the program.
Hi, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So again, this is not unique to the United States, but we see that there's always been this split between political elites and the public.
Right.
And this is especially true on the topic of war. And we see that uh, politicians tend to get elected into the White House on peace platforms, again, from Bush all the way to Trump, but then it usually only takes a few weeks before they switch. Um, so I wanted to ask first, how are you reading the growing disenchantment with Trump as he kind of follows this tradition of becoming increasingly a war president? Do you do you see any uh, major issues in the split in MAGA or the recent elections, local elections, though, in the United States?
Well, with regards to foreign policy and militarism and war and the presidency, I think it was Tom Woods who said, no matter who you elect, you end up with John McCain. And this reality, as you were describing, Glenn, that the president, no matter who he is overwhelmed, is caught up, is obligated, if you will, to fulfill the roles of an imperial presidency. Some of it is just the inertia, I believe, of the institutions that surround the president. There simply are no other available options. And you also have to wonder what information he actually receives. And I could talk personally about having to testify in 2009 to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board as to the quality of information President Obama was receiving regarding Afghanistan. I mean, so part of it is the institutional infrastructure that surrounds the president, whether it be the personnel, whether it be the ongoing policies, or whether it just be the role of being an imperial president. There's also this belief for both Democrats and Republicans that war is good for politics. Karl Rove famously said to George W. Bush, wartime presidents get reelected. I believe David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel said the same thing too to Barack Obama as they were debating escalating the Afghan war. So there's a rationale, as revolting as it may be, to why they choose to go along with these escapades. Now, there's a political cost to wars. We saw that in the '06 election, the '08 election, the 2016 election, and that's why you've seen this shift in American warfighting policy to hide American warfare, to use proxies, to use contractors, or to use CIA and special operations forces, so that whoever is in power doesn't have to bear the political costs of American casualties in war. I think all this is something that the Trump administration understands. Trump, in his first term, was a hawk. He was really elected on what many would describe an anti-war platform. There is evidence that demonstrates that those views, particularly those held by parts of the county that suffered high degrees of casualties in the Iraq and Afghan wars, voted for Trump over Clinton because of those wars. But it's pretty clear as soon as he comes into office in 2017, that's not what he's going to do, whether it's his massive escalation of the war in Afghanistan or his escalation of support to Ukraine. You see that he is not the anti-war president that many people thought he might be. That shift helped him again in the last election, and so that's why I think people are feeling that they've been fooled again. The rug's been pulled out from under them. He's not, or something sinister or insidious or Machiavelli or Svengali or Rasputin presence must be there. But certainly, we see his understanding of the empire different than any of his predecessors, but he still is an imperial president, and that involves, if not expanding the empire, then maintaining it of course, using the military when necessary.
Because I've spoken with men in the United States who were quite taken by his initial
Mhm.
message. That is, that this is simply not sustainable. And it kind of goes with a lot of theoretical assumptions as well, which is that the whole structure of empire, as you say, it was premised on um, well, a unipolar distribution of power. So the concern, of course, is if you have all these new rising centers of power, attempting to maintain an empire would simply exhaust the United States and incentivize the main great powers in the international system to cooperate to collectively balance the U.S. So it's not a winning strategy, but so there was a very logical case for why it was in the national interest of the U.S. to pull back,
Right.
again, recover its strength, create a more natural balance of power in Eurasia. That these great powers would naturally balance each other if the U.S. wasn't so strongly present. But Trump seemed to fuel this kind of a base who still believes in it, but they seem to have broken with Trump, but held on to the idea. Do you see? I mean, especially if we look at the Israeli issue, I find this to be interesting that you now have people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, quite you know big names who are very openly saying, "Well, why are we surprised? Why are we supporting Israel in this way? I mean, if we can't explain why this serves our national interest, then we shouldn't do it. That's what America First should be." So, do you see Trump losing control over this America First?
I mean, both parties uh, have lost a position and status and support because of Israel. The Democratic Party, more so than the Republican Party. Kamala Harris loses the election because of this. We know that if Harris had shifted to a position of an arms embargo against Israel, public opinion tells us that she would have won key states and would have won the election. The Democrats chose in 2024 to maintain their relationship with the Israel lobby at the expense of winning the election. I mean, so that's where the Democrats are on this. Now, the Republicans, particularly among younger Republicans, exactly like you said, Glenn, you're seeing disenchantment, this separation from longstanding commitments and relationships to the narrative of the American-Israeli relationship. And so, particularly in younger Republicans, you're seeing that move. And I think that for Donald Trump, the issue becomes one of not just maintaining the relationship with his political donors, such as Miriam Adelson, who between her and her late husband gave close to $500 million, I believe, over 3 elections to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And now Adelson is saying that she'll give $20 million to unseat Tom Massey, the great libertarian representative from Kentucky, because of his opposition to Israel. So there certainly is an alarm within the Republican Party that we have to do more, that we have to prevent any type of breaking from this longstanding relationship we've had with the Israel lobby as an extension of the relationship with Israel. But I think for the most part, they feel it's manageable. I think they feel it's something that they can throw money at. You see more and more reports of the scale and the scope of the propaganda campaigns that are being launched by the Israeli government to rebuild what it has lost among the American population. And interestingly, where they're focusing their efforts are on those who have been long-term Israel supporters, so particularly among white evangelical Christians. So, in Donald Trump's case, uh, this continuance of a relationship with Israel also has to do with, I think, personal gain. And I think, particularly say with the plan going forward for Gaza, that there is a desire to enrich. Certainly, the desire by, as expressed by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, their plans to rebuild Gaza, those expressed by Donald Trump through his various AI videos of building resorts and, God help us, probably casinos or something like that. There's an idea of getting something out of it. So that transactional basis, I think, undergirds Trump's relationship with Israel. And so unless there's something stronger that is a greater transaction, it has greater leverage or greater gain for Donald Trump, I think he remains committed to Israel, for the foreseeable future.
And how do you make sense of the election of Mamdani, though, in New York? I get it is a good indicator, though, that sentiment is changing. That is, in terms of people being prepared to bet on a populist from political left to address some of the economic issues as well as the issue of war, of course. But of course, I'm not saying that this will necessarily result in policy changes. Again, this is New York, not the White House, but we have people like Obama as well who kind of ran on the same populism on the left. Change, break with the failed policies of the past, and again, it's nice to get elected this way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that much change will happen. But it is an indicator, though, of where the people are moving. When it seems very unlikely that a person like Mamdani would have been able to be elected only a few years ago.
Well, he comes in that line, right? And we have to first, I guess, preface it, Glenn, with New York is New York, and New York is different than the rest of the United States in a way that I know when I've visited Germany, I've gone to Berlin, people are like, "You've not been to Germany, you've been to Berlin." Or the same when you go to the UK and you visit London, you've been to London, you haven't been to England, and you certainly haven't been to other parts of the UK. So New York is like that. It's its own unique place. It is very left of center. So it's a Democratic bastion, has been, for my entire lifetime. Um, and I think what you've seen is the line that with Barack Obama, with Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of a populist economic desire within Democratic voters to change the system, not just to have one-off or simple fixes, not just to have immediate remedies for problems, saying providing a subsidy for this or changing the tax code for that, but rather systemic change. And I think that's what Mamdani promises. Mamdani is offering help to those who feel that they are underwater. I think what many Americans, and though as represented through New York, because as I say that, Glenn, about Mamdani being in New York and New York is special, there was an enthusiasm for his campaign throughout the United States. And so you can make the argument that, New York leads. So as New York goes, eventually the country will follow that. As New York goes in 5, 10, 15 years, you will see that replicated across the country. And I think that that's very valid. But what he cut into, what he opened up here, was this idea that so many Americans are underwater, that so many Americans are crushed by overhead, right? That when you get down to the basis of like, what is wealth inequality really about? You're talking about the unfair, unjust burden on working people. And we shouldn't even say working people anymore, because the United States, in terms of its the reality is that the burdens faced by working class are those same faced by the middle class. You have 60% of Americans who make more than $100,000 living paycheck to paycheck. And so while the paycheck to paycheck reality of someone working class is different, of course, than the middle class, at the end of the day, it's still the same anxieties. It's still the same frustrations. It's still the same fears. And, this weight of the overhead that's on American families, whether it be healthcare costs, whether it be housing costs, whether it be the cost of utilities, your electric, your water, whether it be childcare or getting to work. This is what Mamdani is tapping into. This is what he is opening up and expressing this reality for so many Americans that it's just too expensive to live your lives and then have any money in your bank account at the end of the month. And so it goes again beyond like the simple, hey, we'll do a child tax care credit. We'll get thousands of dollars more into people's pockets. That will help them. This is really addressing the fundamental unfairness, the fundamental corruption of the American economic system. And that is what scares the hell out of establishment Democrats, centrist Democrats, and of course, the billionaire class that it donated so much money, gave so much money to try and keep Mamdani out of power.
There's an interesting different split happening though. That is in the past you could see, again, it's not just on the political right where you see some splits in terms of what should define the political right, but on the political left as well. And I was thinking about a tweet by Kamala Harris lately because Dick Cheney passed away, and again, in the early 2000s, he was more or less seen as the embodiment of evil by many on the political left, simply because of the role he had in the Iraq War, which caused a lot of devastation for American soldiers, but also, of course, for the Iraqi population. But she went out and tweeted that he was a devoted public servant and more or less celebrating his legacy. Now I'm I don't like the yeah I one can see that one wants to speak kindly of the people as they pass away, but it is a peculiar how you often see this almost poaching of different political forces, or the here it almost looks as if some on the political left is seeking to win over some neoconservative uh, voters who feel, disenfranchised by Trump's direction, or it's very hard often for external people to read. So how are you assessing this?
Yeah, yeah, you're getting into kind of a critique or an interpretation of the American elite, right? Of the ruling class and the various tranches and cliques that reside within it, and then specifically for political power, the view within establishment, the Democrats and Republicans of Trump as an outsider. And so this man, Dick Cheney, who was a war criminal, who authorized torture, who authorized massive violations of American civil liberties. First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment violations. It was called Stellar Wind, where the George W. Bush administration was spying on the American public, on their telephone calls, on intercepting their messages. This man was a criminal. In ways that we could do a whole episode, Glenn, just going through Cheney's career and his, you know, what, as you described, embodiment of evil, essentially, his willingness to get for gain at the expense of other people's pains and suffering, let alone his complete disregard for the law, whether that be American federal law, the American Constitution, and certainly international law. And so you saw, but what happens at the end of Cheney's life is he comes out against Donald Trump. And this makes him now a cause, a celebrity, if you will. He becomes an icon among Democrats, a man who, yeah, we disagree with, but you see, fundamentally, he's a patriot. Fundamentally, he's a Democrat. He's like us, unlike Donald Trump. So we can forgive the fact that maybe his war in Iraq killed 4,500 American service members, and more so, maybe as possibly as many as 1 million Iraqis. We can forgive that because right now, he is a Democrat. He is a patriot, and this gets in again to that clique, right? That those concentrations of power within power. And it wasn't just Harris who lauded him. It was Bill Clinton. It was Joe Biden. It was Nancy Pelosi. So the Democratic old guard. But the idea of using Dick Cheney and particularly his daughter Liz Cheney who became a celebrity among Democrats because she was a Republican who stood up against Donald Trump. Never mind that her policies, her votes, her views were no different than her father. She should just be as equally repugnant to anyone who is a liberal or a leftist as her father was. But because she opposed Trump, because our political system in the United States revolves fundamentally around identity issues, that was all that was needed to not just rehabilitate Dick Cheney, but to make Liz Cheney the darling of the Democratic Party, right? I mean, to the point, Glenn, that Liz Cheney is the person who appears most on stage with Vice President Harris during her presidential campaign. It's just staggering to understand that, to think that the Democratic Party, the DNC, the Harris campaign would say the best person for us to have on stage with our candidate is Liz Cheney. But that was the mania. That is the mindset of a party that's so devoted to maintaining the status quo, so devoted to seeking power as the ends, not the means, and so devoted to the idea of pursuing that through identity that they're going to use Liz Cheney as Harris's most prominent surrogate. You have this reality, and this is now you can understand why the Democratic Party is even less popular than Donald Trump. And Trump's popularity, while it's slipping, it's still not catastrophic. In the last month or so, it's gone down, particularly in relation, I believe, to the government shutdown. But last I looked last week, he was at 43%, which isn't that far off from his predecessors. And before the shutdown started, he was at 46%, which was actually better than any of his predecessors at this point in time. And so now, as it appears the shutdown is ending with the capitulation of the Democratic Party via 7 senators this morning, we're likely to see a rebound of Donald Trump's popularity back to where, yeah, it's not, it's mid 40s, which is where many American presidents often reside.
It is interesting though that seemingly a lot of the American voters wanted change, and Kamala Harris, she couldn't have signaled status quo more than
Right. Oh, you see,
up with
like,
Cheney. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, one of the first things she says, Glenn, is like, I wouldn't do anything fundamentally different than Joe Biden did, right? Or she wouldn't change anything. And then even, this point's made by the commentator Brianna Joy Gray quite well, that in the first few weeks of her taking on the nomination, where Harris was doing no media interviews. And very few statements were coming out of the campaign. Other than that, nothing is going to change. We're going to, I wouldn't do anything different than Joe Biden did the last 4 years. The one policy that was made clear was that she would not break from Israel. And again, that's having all that public opinion knowledge, right? All those polls that told us that this is an issue that will cost you millions of votes and will likely cost you the presidency. And again, the Democrats wanting to maintain that status quo so terribly felt that maintaining a relationship with the Israel lobby was more important than actually winning the presidential election.
well, at some point though, if one doesn't make change on one's own, it will be forced upon you. That is, Rand Paul, he made a comment once, I think it's over a year ago, but I thought it was it was a good one. He was arguing we have an opportunity now to reduce the empire in an organized way to preserve the republic, and but if we fail to do this, this decision will be made for us, so it will fall apart and it will be uncontrolled, and then it would harm the republic. So and I thought that was interesting because the it does seem that the US has exhausted itself to a large extent. Again, not just with the rise of rising powers across the world, as I mentioned, but the US, it seems to have stretched its military to thin as well. Again, not just in money and military hardware, but growing lack of support by soldiers and the public. Do you see the foreign policy being sustainable in its current form?
No, I don't. And you made the point earlier, Glenn, about this uh, revisiting of the empire by the Trump administration, is understanding that the empire as it is cannot be sustained. And this is where Trump fundamentally breaks as an imperial president, right, to his predecessors. Where if you look at, say, particularly the Biden administration through Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken, this idea that they will not give up the empire. I mean, we can go and examine their decisions, but the idea of preserving the empire is, and particularly the idea of preserving the United States as the unipolar power, right? And this gets back to the George H.W. Bush administration with the policy put in place that the United States is the primary power in the world, is the sole superpower, and everything must be done to maintain that. And any threat that arises must be destroyed. And that is the policy of all succeeding presidencies up until this presidency, where, and this is not an endorsement of what Trump is doing. I have my own views on what we should do, but to try and understand what he's doing, I believe, as you were saying, Glenn, it's this idea of consolidation. It's this idea that we're not facing a multipolar world. We're already in a multipolar world. That this is not something 5, 10, 15 years coming. This is something that exists in. And it's just not nation states, that there won't be dominant nation states and alliances that we have to be concerned with, but it's these formations of countries, these groupings, such as the BRICS, or that are fungible, that are flexible, and that nations can belong to multiple groupings without the firm commitments of, say, the Cold War, where it was ironclad that you were West, you were East, or maybe you were in that non-aligned movement. But what we're seeing is a multilateral world, a multipolar world, excuse me, at the same time, the dissolution of any type of international order. So I think one of the key takeaways for the last 5 years, especially, was the dissolution of international structure, whether it be institutions or international law. I think the weakening and the irrelevancy of international law and international institutions like the United Nations is only going to worsen. And so it becomes really an open field, if you will, with nothing over the top of it that provides a semblance of structure or a semblance of order. And people can critique that, of course, because how meek was that to begin with, but at least it existed. And so I think the Trump administration understands that, and I think their idea is that we have to pull back, we have to consolidate. I think that's why there is this emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. Go to the as they call it, the Dunroe Doctrine. Consolidate here in the Western Hemisphere. This idea of friendshoring, which is a euphemism, of course. It would be control of those countries, making sure that the resources that we need, imports, et cetera, are coming from capitals that are firmly under our control. The idea of not extending ourselves into places where we don't have a real and tangible interest. That if you cannot prove, via a data set or maybe a checklist on an Excel spreadsheet or something, that this is fundamental in the sense of providing some form of benefit to the United States, we shouldn't be expanding resources. In a case in point, of course, the way the Trump administration appears to be happy to let the Europeans continue the war in Ukraine. They see benefits to the United States, but not of the sense that means, not of any sense that mean, we should be expending our resources. We saw this, Glenn, in, remember back in, was it February or March, as the United States, as this administration was beginning its campaign against the Yemenis in the Red Sea, and you had the leaked signal messages. And I can't remember if it was Waltz or if it was Vance who wrote in those messages, what are we doing this for? Only 6% of our trade, or whatever the number was, comes through the Red Sea. This is not our problem. right? So I think there's that understanding that permeates many within the Trump administration. The other aspect of it too is that you have now a Homeland Security advisor in Stephen Miller who has power unlike any previous Homeland Security advisors. I couldn't even name a previous Homeland Security advisor. Homeland Security secretaries, yes, but the Homeland Security advisor now, through as Stephen Miller is incorporating that role, has the same importance, has the same primacy in the White House as the National Security Advisor does. And so you see understanding of American foreign policy as having to incorporate the priorities of domestic policy in a way that goes beyond, our understanding, as you learn in International Relations 101, that foreign policy is ultimately a reflection of domestic politics. This is 2 or 3 steps beyond that. So if you look at, say, the Western Hemisphere, this destruction, this extrajudicial killing, this murder of people in speedboats in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, you can understand that as Stephen Miller, the Homeland Security advisor, seeing that as necessary, as integral, if you will, to his policies within the United States of, mass detention, mass deportation, that this is all part of the, for lack of a better term, purification of the United States that Miller is pushing so hard on. So I think you see these various aspects coming together to form a bit of a method to the madness of Donald Trump's foreign policy. Now, there's certainly a lot of madness in it. I mean, there certainly is still a neoconservative ideology that's latent. You see that among his top advisors. You certainly see the transactional aspects. We discussed a bit of that with regards to Gaza, say. You certainly see the petulance, the temperament of Donald Trump himself. I'm going to tariff Brazil because they jailed my friend Bolsonaro, right? I mean, and right. I mean, so there's still all these other parts that come into play. This is certainly not a doctrine as you would imagine Kissinger or Brzezinski would write out. But, it certainly is, I think, a doctrine or a grand strategy, if you will, that has some semblance of rationality to it that you may or may not disagree with. But I think it is there.
Well, when one speaks of the world having already transitioned into a multipolar distribution of power, and one uh, recognizes that the policies have to adjust to these realities, it still begs the question, what kind of policies? Because there's different ways one can respond. Some would want to restore the unipolar order. Some would want to say, well, we're going to have to now pull back on the empire and go back home and rebuild our strength. Others would seek, just focus on some areas, not others. But then, of course, which areas to focus on? This is a complicated, creates a lot of divisions. And of course, Trump, I think you touched on it. I think he wants, that's not necessarily to abandon the empire. I think he wants a better return on investment. So, have
Exactly.
the
Yeah. I
allies
mean,
pay some tribute.
yeah, exactly. I think, Glenn, that phrase, return on investment, is very much how he views it. I mean, we have to remember he is a real estate magnate, right? That's where he built his fortune. That's how he grew up. His father was had a tremendous real estate business, right? I mean, this is his worldview. This is his mindset. This is how he was conditioned throughout his life, was to look, if this neighborhood is not going to perform, if you're not going to get your money back by building condominiums or hotels or whatever in this neighborhood, you find another neighborhood. In the same way, too, his contempt for those who occupy those neighborhoods is well understood as well. That he believes that property is to who can seize it, who can take it. And so his disdain, of course, for other people's, I think, is a replication of how he conducted himself in his real estate dealings, through many decades. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what you're looking at in policies, it's this administration, you're dealing with Donald Trump, and so you have a man who, at the beginning of this term, said he wanted to cut nuclear weapons, wanted to get rid of them. And now, of course, he's talking about nuclear testing again. This is an administration that said they were willing to talk to the Russians, wanting to talk to the Russians and to stay in arms control. And then when the Russians offer an extension of the New START treaty, the Americans, as far as I know, still haven't replied to the Russians. And it's been, what, a month now, at least? So you've got the problems in terms of understanding and analyzing and predicting this administration, because Donald Trump is, what you get in the morning may not be different than what you get in the afternoon. So in terms of specific policies, I think it might be hard to as long as Trump is president, to ascertain that. But I think if his view becomes what, say, J.D. Vance maintains, if Vance continues this presidency after Trump is out of office, I think then you'd have a better understanding of this idea of the United States settling into role of still the empire, maybe the preeminent empire of the world, but one that is consolidated in the Western Hemisphere, still has its vassals in Europe and among South Korea, Japan, Australia, but then has much more flexible relationships with other nations, and particularly relationships that are based on bilateral associations, so one country to one country, as opposed to falling under any type of international agreements, international treaties, international institutions. And so a very reactive, very flexible type of dealing with the world, and we could beat the 1984 cliche even further, in the sense that you shift one day you're at war with one nation and the next day you're at peace with it, and I think that may be the structure that Trump presidency is moving towards, and that I think a Vance presidency would maintain. And by doing that, as you describe it, this being able to better balance the United States in a multipolar world, as opposed to the way that traditional neoconservative Republicans or neoconservative Democrats want to maintain that unipolar structure, want to maintain American primacy. When I think of the Biden presidency and I think of the decisions made by, say, Sullivan and Blinken, I think of Dylan Thomas's poem, "Don't Go Quietly into the Good Night," to rage against the dying light, right? And the danger in that, of course, and we have an expression in the United States that a dying mule kicks hardest. And so you can imagine the dangers that come from a dying empire that refuses to acknowledge the reality of the world, refuses to give up its sole superpower status when it has long passed. You can imagine the dangers of a dying empire kicking just like a dying mule does.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy. Also, with the Trump's real estate dealings as well as foreign policy, I didn't think about it exactly in those terms, but I remember watching the old videos of Trump from the 80s and the early 90s when he was on Oprah Winfrey, and he was making the point, like, because he talked about first his real estate deals, and then he switched in the next breath to foreign policy, and he says, why are the Japanese not paying us for security?
Right.
We look after security; they should be paying us. So he took it very business approach to it. Um, but in terms of the divisions, because it is interesting, as not just U.S. politics, you can put Europe in that camp too, but in the United States, even though politics becomes very polarized, where there seems to always be a bipartisan consensus is when it's time to go to war. And I think part of this has been a bit from the unipolar order. Of course, there's a lot of consensus as well from the Cold War, but in the unipolar order, when you have the people aspiring for global primacy and those arguing for, liberal democratic values, which has to be defended through U.S. leadership, kind of there's some unholy marriage almost that they find each other. But in the multipolar system, I think maybe Trump overestimates the extent to which he can choose what to prioritize, because one should expect more pushback from both the political class as well as society, that one needs to make priorities when you can't
Hmm.
be everywhere at the same time. But then again, what do you prioritize? So far, it looks as if Trump says, we want the Western Hemisphere and, of course, Asia, because that's where China is. But then you have to pivot away from Europe. But once a pivot away from Europe comes into question, then, of course, what happens to the NATO partnership? And you will have infighting. What about pulling out of Middle East? And you're going to have to, many people will ask for reducing ties with Israel, because that's what drags America into the region. And suddenly you will have this infighting. And I don't know, it's very strange, because often you get the impression that they see the multipolar system being there, but they haven't really absorbed it yet. That is, whenever we see Turkey, for example, they lean a bit now towards China and Russia sometimes, and in Europe as well. The first comment is always, "Oh, are they going to align with them against us?" So they don't seem to appreciate the idea that they want to diversify their ties to deal with both both sides. Same with Saudi Arabia, and even Trump had a comment when Modi decided to go to China and meet with Putin and Xi. He tweeted something along the lines that, India has chosen China and Russia. I wish them good luck. He sounds, like it's like a heartbroken, someone cheated on him. It was an interesting tweet, but again, it kind of reflected the same idea. But India never wanted to choose Russia and China over US. They wanted to diversify. They wanted to live in the multipolar world where they deal with everyone. It's it was Americans who sanctioned or put tariffs on them. It was Americans who threatened secondary sanctions on them, telling them you have to choose. India never wanted to choose. They still really would like to have a very close and productive relationship with the US. But you see the Trump administration and the wider, I guess, Washington political establishment prepared to accept this kind of multipolar world where countries will not only want to align with Washington.
Yeah, I mean that's a fundamental problem you have with this Trump grand strategy, is that it all runs through Trump, and that's not based upon principle. It's not based upon institutions. Not based upon agreements. I think it will face a tremendous amount of pushback in the United States because it abandons decades-long understanding of what the American empire should be doing overseas, how it should be conducting itself. One, again, this idea of ceding its authority as a unipolar power, but the other aspects of it too. I mean, so many American foreign policy elites, as well as the operatives within American foreign policy, they are disciples, they are acolytes of Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski. And so they see the world as the chessboard. They understand the world has to be a map like the game Risk. And so to have this type of foreign policy that's predicated on Trump's personal decision making is very difficult for them to swallow. And that's why I think whoever his successor is will have a difficult time, not impossible time, but maintaining it, just because the inertia has been for decades one way. And that, of course, is ruinous for the United States. You reminded me with the one tweet he sent. He also sent the other tweet when Vladimir Putin was in China, and he accused Putin and Xi Jinping of conspiring against him. I mean, so much of this is personal, and you see that acted out, Glenn, through the execution of American policy. You see who is leading major American foreign policy efforts with regards to war and peace. It's Steve Witkoff. It's not the U.S. State Department, and Witkoff doesn't even have a staff. It's just Steve Witkoff and his, iPhone or whatever. And who's his companion? It's Jared Kushner. Again, someone who's not in government, who doesn't have a staff. So all these high level, big hand movement of history type negotiations are being carried out with by two men who are not part of the American government, who are not part of the institutions. More so, they are his son-in-law and his real estate buddy. So you can really see the personal nature of all this, which then, of course, extends if you're another country trying to understand how you're going to fit into the American structure, how you're going to fit into American foreign policy. This is very, very difficult. And so you get in a position where it's, do we hew to the whims of the individual, of the emperor, or do we continue with our desire to have a multilateral approach to the world. Some nations, some nations are hedging, others have made it clear what they'll do. Some, of course, have bent and kissed the ring. If a week ago, Donald Trump's visit to Asia, he's got the new prime minister of Japan saying enthusiastically that she's going to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He goes to Korea. President Lee one-ups Prime Minister Takashi by giving Trump the Korean Medal of Honor for Peace, as well as a gold crown. I mean, so the decision making by several nations is clear that they will remain vassals of the empire and they will go as the Trump wind blows, which we can get a whole conversation as to why these states are choosing to do that, but they are the states, I think, Korea, Japan, Australia, the Europeans that see maintenance of the status quo, however poor it may be, to be a better option than going out on their own. They're so hollowed out. They're so vapid. They have they have no ability to operate in the world on their own, except as part of the American empire. And particularly for those who are in power, they see no resolution for them leaving the American empire that is better than the status quo. So they'll maintain it, even though they're constantly humiliated by the American president. I mean, recall that photo of the European leaders sitting like school children in front of Trump's desk, or at Sharm el-Sheikh, where he's got them all lined up behind him. And he just goes on for 45 minutes with these heads of state standing awkwardly, like shuffling their feet and hands in pockets and getting tired, obviously, this humiliation. And they're willing to accept that to maintain their position in the American empire, then branch out on their own. And I think that is something that the White House understands and is banking on.
Yeah, no, I think the Europeans become a perfect case study in how the optimal relationship for Trump would be. That is being told, this is you can only have one partner like among the great powers, because the Europeans should not be too close with either Russia, China, or any other major power. And once they only have the United States, they do have to dance to the tune of Washington. But it's perplexing, because the Europeans, from the time Trump got elected, they were gonna this time around they were gonna stand together, stand strong, do not take any of his shenanigans. But as soon as he snapped his fingers, they all bowed. So
Yeah, yeah,
but I do think it's also part of the decades of a lot of dependence on the United States, economically, security, the entire political identity of the political West. Wouldn't really be able to would be difficult to preserve without the U.S. at the center. So I think it's just a lack of political imagination and will, and essentially treating multipolarity as if it's a policy rather than a actual reality in terms of distribution of power.
right,
But
right.
again, holding on to the status quo relationship with the U.S. doesn't mean that it will remain status quo, because the U.S. of course will have to behave differently as well. It has to deprioritize the Europeans. They do have to do other things. So I think they're holding on to wanting to recreate the 90s, even though the conditions for this is long gone. But I just had one final question though, which is how do you assess Trump's peace efforts? This is one of the things he takes great pride in, though, that he ends every war around the world,
Right, right.
and he wants the peace prize. But from Gaza, but also in the negotiations with Russia, do you, how are you assessing this? Because at times it seems almost like at best they're going for a pause, or to regroup. Again, I'm not quite sure if I'm getting Trump correct, because sometimes it does look like he genuinely wants to get an end to the war. On the other hand, sometimes it looks like his end to the war would be um, still wanting some kind of a victory, that is Ukraine kind of being a front still against Russia. Again, it's very hard
Yeah.
for me to read, though.
Right, exactly. I think it's hard for all of us, right? I mean, I think we all have to be kind to ourselves trying to assess this presidency and this administration because we are dealing with a figure unlike what any seen before. I mean, this is a man who has no loyalty to the infrastructure that keeps him in power, right? I mean, where uh, 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 an Obama, a Bush, a Biden, whoever, you could more or less 80% confidence have an understanding of what decision they would make. Whether it's because of their previous decisions, whether it's because of the metaphysical aspects of their worldview and their party's worldview and the institutions they came from, we could generally understand where they were going to go. With Donald Trump, it's not that way at all, and so I think we do need to be kind to ourselves as we try to assess him. Um, his view towards war is schizophrenic. I do believe that when he came into office this term and stood in the Capitol Rotunda and was sworn in and made his inaugural address, he really did feel that desire to be the peacemaker. He really does want to be known in history as the man who went around the world and made peace. I think that's a real legitimate desire. On the other side, there is this duality, which we all have in our lives, of a man who enjoys the militarism, who enjoys the power, who we refer to Dostoevsky's famous quote on how power and blood is intoxicating. And I think that type of rush, that lust, is within him. His desire to have a military parade in Washington, D.C. on his birthday. He likes those types of things. You see his calls for war in whether it be Venezuela, whether it be in Nigeria, his willingness to threaten other nations. These are all occurring at the same time, many times on the same day, even as he's promoting himself as having stopped, I don't know what his number he's up to now, 8 wars or something like that, right? And most of those were not, I mean, so I think this comes to this idea where he sees things that don't make sense. These wars, these slaughters, this squandering of resources, right? He sees it and it doesn't make sense because it doesn't make sense. These wars are irrational, and any of us who are sane have an understanding that peace is much more prosperous than war. He gets that. But then he's got his own personal involvement in this, where the temperament issues, the ego issues, the power and blood are intoxicating aspects, the wanting to control it. And so if he can't get peace, then he'll make war. And I mean, I think it's ultimately something that we'll struggle with for as long as he's in office, is this inability to really ascertain what he's going to do, where he's going to go with this. He's malleable, of course, and he was very malleable in his first administration. I mean, this idea that the last suggestion he heard was a suggestion he was going to go with, I think holds a lot of water for the way he ran the presidency his first time around. This time around, not so much, I believe. I think he's much stronger in his desires. But and you look at just then with this, you look at the people he has surrounding him. These are all warlike people. When he addressed the United Nations, the Americans who were sitting in the audience, it was Michael Waltz, it was Marco Rubio, it was Scott Bessent. These are all neoconservatives. These are all hawks. These are all men who don't want peace with Russia. They want victory over Russia. Certainly he's got Marco Rubio whispering in one ear about regime change in Venezuela, and Stephen Miller whispering in the other about the need to carry out violence throughout Latin America in order to support their domestic efforts to, with regards to ICE and everything. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have a difficult time, or we have a difficult time, and that difficult time is going to continue throughout this presidency, understanding where he wants to go.
Yeah, no, I often get the same impression that he does want peace, but he wants it done, the ideal peace on his own terms,
Right.
which is and he's the perfect guy to deliver the peace because he knows how to land the big deals. This is deal maker. That's his big thing. And but it looks like the main approach is always basing it on good personal relations with other leaders, and then through strength under his leadership, which often translates into maximum pressure.
Yeah.
So as long as you can go this path, I think even Iran he would want a deal. But again, not the deal others made, because he can give the real proper deal. I just think it's very difficult to translate some of this again experiences from deal making in real estate to politics, because in when you come across especially great powers who sees this as being existential issues, it's yeah, doing the maximum pressure often is counterproductive. So
Right, right. Yeah.
anyways, thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope you can come back back on the program again. Thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Anytime.